"We'll get you your water when we feel like it," the platinum blonde flight attendant said with a smirk that could cut glass, having no idea she had just signed her own termination papers at 35,000 feet. Devon Washington pulled his vintage Nirvana hoodie closer as he walked through the gleaming corridors of Heathrow Airport, his worn leather messenger bag slung casually over his shoulder. To the hurried business travelers rushing past him, he looked like any other passenger trying to catch a flight to Los Angeles, maybe a tech worker or a graduate student heading home. What they couldn't see was the 42-year-old man beneath the casual exterior who had just spent 3 days in the most exclusive boardrooms of London finalizing a deal that would reshape the airline industry forever. The numbers were still dancing in Devon's head as he approached the Neptune Airways gate, $12 billion in private equity built from absolutely nothing in the span of 18 years. His father, Devon Washington, had been an airline mechanic at LAX for 37 years, working on the very aircraft that refused to promote him beyond the maintenance bay, no matter how brilliant his innovations or how spotless his safety record. Jerome had come home every night with stories that made young Devon's blood boil, stories about being passed over for supervisor positions that went to white men with half his experience, about having his technical suggestions dismissed until a white colleague repeated them word for word. Those stories had planted a seed in Devon's mind that grew into something much larger than personal ambition. He hadn't built Meridian Holdings just to get rich, though the wealth was undeniable. He had built it to acquire companies like Neptune Airways and transform them from the inside out to ensure that no other Devon Washington would spend decades being invisible in his own workplace. The leather bag bouncing against his hip contained documents that proved he now owned the very airline he was about to board, having completed the acquisition just 48 hours earlier in a deal so secretive that not even Neptune's board of directors knew their new owner was about to test their company culture firsthand. Devon's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his legal team, Phoenix Protocol, ready for activation. "All surveillance systems monitored. Awaiting your signal." He smiled grimly as he slipped the phone back into his hoodie pocket. Phoenix Protocol was his personal code for the complete documentation and restructuring of discriminatory workplace cultures, named after his father's favorite saying, "Son, sometimes you have to let the whole thing burn down before something beautiful can rise from the ashes." The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, calling for premium business class passengers. Devon joined the line, his boarding pass showing seat 2C, and watched as his fellow travelers were sorted into the invisible hierarchies that airlines love to maintain. The woman in front of him wore a Chanel suit and carried a Hermes bag that cost more than most people's cars. Behind him, a white businessman in an expensive Italian suit was already on his phone, loudly discussing million-dollar deals as if the entire gate area was his personal conference room. Devon had dressed deliberately for this flight, choosing clothes that would trigger exactly the kind of assumptions he needed to document. The hoodie was cashmere, custom-made in Scotland and worth more than most people's monthly salaries, but it looked like something you could buy at any mall. His jeans were designer denim with subtle details that only fashion experts would recognize, and his sneakers were limited edition collaborations that resellers flipped for thousands of dollars. But to the average observer, especially one predisposed to making judgments based on race and appearance, he looked like someone who had stumbled into premium class through luck or frequent flyer miles, rather than belonging there by right. As the line moved forward and Devon approached the aircraft door, he felt the familiar mix of anticipation and steel-cold determination that had driven him through every major acquisition. This wasn't just about buying an airline, it was about buying justice for his father and every other person who had been made to feel invisible because someone else decided they didn't look the part. He was about to give Neptune Airways crew the most expensive customer service lesson in aviation history, and they had no idea that their new owner was walking through their door wearing a hoodie and carrying the power to change their lives forever. In the galley of Flight 847, Cassandra Blake adjusted her platinum blonde hair in the small mirror and straightened her navy blue scarf with the precision of someone who viewed her appearance as a weapon of authority. At 35, she had spent 12 years perfecting the art of customer service that looked impeccable from the outside while being selectively withholding based on her personal judgments about who deserved respect and who needed to be reminded of their place. Cassandra had grown up in Orange County, the daughter of a real estate developer who had taught her that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who served those who mattered. Her job as Neptune Airways lead flight attendant wasn't just about safety demonstrations and beverage service in her mind. It was about maintaining the natural order of things, ensuring that the right people received the right level of attention, while others learned to be grateful for whatever scraps of service they received. She surveyed the premium cabin through the galley window, mentally categorizing the passengers with the efficiency of a customs agent. Seat 1. A held Ambassador Patricia Williams, a distinguished black woman in her late 50s whose diplomatic credentials and first-class bearing commanded automatic respect even from someone as prejudiced as Cassandra. The woman's elegant bearing and obviously expensive accessories placed her in the category of people who could cause problems if mistreated, so she would receive flawless service. Seats 1B and 1C were occupied by white business executives whose expensive suits and confident postures immediately marked them as Cassandra's preferred type of passenger, the kind who tipped well and never questioned her authority. She had already decided they would receive her warmest smiles and most attentive service, the kind of treatment that made people feel special and important. But Seat 2C was going to be a problem. Cassandra had watched the man board taking in his casual clothes and relaxed demeanor with the sharp eye of someone who made snap judgments for a living. He didn't fit her mental template of what a premium passenger should look like, which meant he was either an upgrade who didn't understand the unspoken rules of first-class etiquette, or worse, someone who thought money could buy respect without earning it through the proper social signals. "Jordan, come here," Cassandra called to the newest member of their crew, a 26-year-old Korean-American woman who had been flying with Neptune for only 3 months and was still learning the complicated social dynamics that Cassandra considered essential to the job. Jordan Kim approached nervously, her training manual still clutched in her hands like a security blanket. "See the passenger in 2C?" Cassandra asked, nodding toward Devon without bothering to lower her voice. "That's going to be a high-maintenance situation. Probably got upgraded through miles or some promotion, doesn't understand that business class isn't just about the bigger seat. It's about maintaining certain standards of behavior. Keep an eye on him, and if he starts making demands or getting entitled, let me handle it." Jordan shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Cassandra and the passenger who was quietly settling into his seat with no signs of the problematic behavior her supervisor was predicting. "He seems pretty calm to me," she offered tentatively. But Cassandra waved off her observation with the dismissive confidence of someone who believed her prejudices were actually professional insights. Elena Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant who had been with Neptune for 8 years, overheard the conversation from where she was preparing the beverage service. As a Latina woman who had faced her own share of assumptions and microaggressions throughout her career, Elena recognized the coded language that Cassandra was using, but she also knew that challenging the lead flight attendant's judgments could result in negative evaluations and limited advancement opportunities. The airline industry was still very much an old boys' club, and those who succeeded learned to navigate its unspoken rules rather than fighting them directly. From the cockpit emerged Captain Ryan Mitchell, a 48-year-old veteran pilot whose silver hair and commanding presence had served him well throughout his 20-year career. Mitchell had learned early on that being a commercial airline captain came with a certain level of respect and deference from both crew and passengers, and he had grown comfortable with the assumption that his authority was absolute within the confines of his aircraft. "Everything ready back here?" Mitchell asked, but his eyes were already focused on the small refrigeration unit where the premium liquor was stored. "I'm thinking it might be a long flight, Cassandra. Maybe have a little something ready in case the turbulence gets rough and I need to settle my nerves." The request was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had made it many times before, and Cassandra nodded with the automatic compliance of someone who had learned that keeping the captain happy was more important than following federal regulations about alcohol consumption during flight operations. She had rationalized the arrangement long ago as part of her job responsibilities, convincing herself that a relaxed captain was a better pilot, even though she knew perfectly well that any amount of alcohol in a pilot's system during flight was a violation that could result in criminal charges. Of course, Captain Cassandra replied, already reaching for the bottle of top-shelf scotch that Mitchell preferred. "Should I set up the usual arrangement?" The usual arrangement involved serving the captain his drinks in coffee cups to avoid detection by passengers or other crew members who might not understand the pressures of command, or the need for certain accommodations to be made for senior personnel. As the final passengers boarded, and the crew began their pre-flight preparations, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just individual prejudices, but an entire culture of selective service and willful blindness to discrimination that had been allowed to flourish under the assumption that some people mattered more than others, and that those judgments could be made based on appearance rather than character. The moment Devon Washington stepped through the aircraft door, Cassandra Blake's practiced smile shifted into something that looked warm from a distance but felt cold as winter rain. She had perfected this particular expression over years of customer service, a smile that met the technical requirements of politeness while communicating unmistakably that the recipient was being barely tolerated rather than welcomed. "Welcome aboard, Cassandra," said her voice, dropping several degrees of warmth as her eyes quickly scanned Devon from head to toe, taking in the hoodie, the jeans, and the casual messenger bag that didn't match her mental image of what a business-class passenger should look like. The assessment took less than 3 seconds, but it was enough to cement her judgment about exactly how much attention this passenger deserved. Devon caught the shift immediately, having experienced variations of this treatment thousands of times throughout his life. The slight tightening around her eyes, the imperceptible step backward, the way her voice changed from genuine welcomes to professional obligation, these were the subtle signals that he had learned to read as accurately as a financial statement. But instead of the anger or frustration that such treatment had triggered in his younger years, Devon felt only a cold sense of professional interest, like a scientist observing a particularly clear example of the behavior he had come to study and eliminate. "Thank you," Devon replied simply, holding up his boarding pass so she could verify his seat assignment. Cassandra barely glanced at the pass before pointing vaguely toward the business class section, not bothering with the open palm gesture that her training manual required, or the specific seat guidance that she had provided to every white passenger who had boarded before him. As Devon made his way to Seat 2C, he observed Cassandra's treatment of the passenger who boarded immediately after him, a white businessman in his 50s wearing a navy suit that probably cost $3,000. The transformation was remarkable. To witness Cassandra's posture straightened her smile, became genuinely radiant, and her voice took on the kind of warmth usually reserved for old friends. "Good evening, sir. Welcome aboard. You're in 2D this evening right here across the aisle. Can I take your jacket for you? Would you prefer your welcome champagne now or after we reach cruising altitude?" The contrast was so stark that several other passengers noticed it, including Ambassador Patricia Williams in Seat 1, whose diplomatic experience had taught her to recognize discrimination in all its subtle forms. Devon settled into his seat and began the process of documenting everything he observed, not through obvious note-taking, but through the kind of careful mental cataloging that had served him well in business negotiations. He noted the time, the specific words used, the body language, the tone of voice, and most importantly, the clear pattern of differential treatment that was emerging before the aircraft had even pushed back from the gate. The welcome champagne service began 15 minutes later, with Cassandra moving through the premium cabin with a silver tray of crystal flutes and a bottle of Dom Perignon that cost more per glass than most people spent on dinner. Devon watched as she served every passenger in business class, offering each person their choice of champagne or sparkling water, explaining the vintage and asking about their preferences with the kind of detailed attention that made people feel special and important. When Cassandra reached Devon's row, she simply walked past without making eye contact, as if seat 2C was empty or its occupant invisible. Devon waited for a reasonable amount of time, then pressed his call button with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that documentation required allowing situations to fully develop before responding. "Excuse me," Devon said, when Cassandra finally approached her expression, already showing annoyance at being summoned. "I didn't receive a welcome drink. Could I have a glass of champagne, please?" Cassandra's lips pursed into something that might have been mistaken for a smile if you weren't looking carefully. "Oh, I'm sorry. We're all out of champagne," she said, gesturing to the tray that still held at least 6 full glasses. "But I can get you some water once we're in the air." The lie was so transparent that Ambassador Williams actually turned in her seat to stare at Cassandra with the kind of diplomatic incredulity usually reserved for international incidents. The businessman in 2D, who had just been served his second glass of champagne, looked uncomfortable and started to offer his glass to Devon before Cassandra quickly moved away to avoid any further discussion. Devon's response was a masterpiece of controlled composure. "That's fine," he said quietly. "Water will be perfect." But his fingers were already moving to his phone, opening an encrypted messaging app and sending a brief message to his legal team. Phase 1 confirmed. Discrimination documented. Begin evidence preservation protocols. Within seconds, his message triggered a response that would have impressed intelligence agencies. Neptune Airways' entire electronic surveillance system was being monitored and backed up by Devon's security team, every camera angle and audio recording being preserved on servers that the airline couldn't access or delete. The flight data recorders were being monitored through legal channels established as part of the acquisition. Even the crew's internal communications were being documented through systems that Devon now owned, but the crew didn't know he controlled. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Devon opened his laptop and began reviewing the personnel files of every crew member on Flight 847. Cassandra Blake's file showed a pattern that was both disturbing and predictable. 8 customer complaints in the past 2 years, all filed by passengers of color, all dismissed by management as unsubstantiated or attributed to difficult passengers who were trying to get special treatment. Captain Mitchell's file was even more interesting, showing a history of minor infractions that had been overlooked because of his seniority and the airline's reluctance to discipline experienced pilots. There had been whispered reports about his drinking, but nothing official. Nothing that would trigger the kind of investigation that could end a career and result in federal charges. Devon closed the laptop as the engines spooled up for takeoff, feeling the familiar sensation of acceleration and lift that had fascinated him since childhood. But this time, the physical ascent was accompanied by a different kind of rising energy, the anticipation of justice that had been building since he first learned about his father's experiences in this very industry. In less than 11 hours, Cassandra Blake and Captain Ryan Mitchell would learn that their assumption about the quiet man in Seat 2C was the most expensive mistake of their professional lives. 2 hours into the flight, with the aircraft cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, Devon Washington made a request so simple that it should have taken less than 30 seconds to fulfill. What happened next would become the most documented case of in-flight discrimination in aviation history, captured on multiple camera angles and preserved in digital formats that would be studied in business schools for decades to come. "Excuse me," Devon said politely when Cassandra Blake passed his seat during the routine beverage service. "Could I please have a glass of water?" The request was delivered in the same calm, respectful tone that Devon used in boardroom negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Cassandra's response made it clear that she viewed this simple human need as an unreasonable demand from someone who had already proven himself to be problematic by existing in business class while not meeting her standards of appearance and social status. "We'll get you your water when we feel like it," Cassandra replied, with a smirk that could have frozen the Atlantic Ocean below them, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the passengers in adjacent seats. "Right now, we're busy taking care of our premium passengers." The words hit the cabin like a physical force, creating a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch for minutes rather than seconds. Ambassador Patricia Williams looked up from her diplomatic correspondence with the kind of sharp attention that had served her well in international crises, immediately recognizing that she was witnessing something that went far beyond poor customer service into territory that demanded documentation and response. Devon's reaction was a masterclass in controlled composure that would have impressed negotiators who had watched him restructure billion-dollar companies without raising his voice or losing his focus. He simply nodded, pulled out his phone, and began typing what appeared to be a casual text message but was actually an encrypted communication to his legal team. Water request refused with hostile language. Multiple witnesses present. Escalation anticipated. Prepare comprehensive response protocols. But Cassandra wasn't finished demonstrating exactly how catastrophically she had misread the situation. As she continued her beverage service, she made a point of stopping at every other seat in the business-class cabin, offering elaborate choices between still water, sparkling water, fresh juices, and specialty beverages, describing each option in detail and asking about ice preferences and garnish choices with the kind of theatrical attention that was designed to emphasize Devon's exclusion. "Can I refresh your champagne, sir?" she asked the businessman in seat 2D, her voice suddenly warm and accommodating. "We also have fresh orange juice, cranberry juice, or I could make you a specialty cocktail if you'd prefer something stronger." The man looked uncomfortable, glancing toward Devon with the kind of social embarrassment that comes from witnessing obvious injustice and not knowing how to respond appropriately. "Actually, I'm fine," he said quietly. But Cassandra continued her performance, pulling out bottles and describing options with exaggerated enthusiasm. From the galley area, the sound of laughter drifted clearly through the cabin as Captain Ryan Mitchell emerged for his scheduled break. Devon could hear the conversation between the captain and Cassandra, their voices carrying with the kind of careless confidence that comes from believing you're among allies who share your prejudices and will support your decisions no matter how problematic they might be. Having trouble with the upgrade passenger, Mitchell asked with a chuckle that suggested he found the situation amusing rather than concerning. "Let me guess he's demanding special treatment and threatening to complain to management about not getting enough attention." "Exactly," Cassandra replied, her voice filled with the satisfaction of someone who believed her supervisor understood and supported her behavior. He asked for water like he was ordering room service at the Four Seasons, then got all attitude when I told him to wait his turn like everyone else. The casual distortion of what had actually occurred was breathtaking in its boldness, transforming Devon's polite request into demanding behavior and Cassandra's hostile response into reasonable customer service management. But what neither of them realized was that their conversation was being recorded not just by Devon's phone, which was legally capturing audio in international airspace, but also by the aircraft's internal security systems that were now under the control of Devon's technical team. Jordan Kim, who had been quietly preparing meal service in the rear galley, found herself in the uncomfortable position of having witnessed both the original interaction and the crew's subsequent distortion of events. As the newest member of the crew, still in her probationary period, she knew that speaking up could cost her the job she desperately needed, but her conscience was making it increasingly difficult to remain silent as she watched the situation escalate. Elena Rodriguez had also observed the discriminatory treatment, and her own experiences as a Latina woman in the airline industry gave her a clear understanding of exactly what was happening and why it was wrong. But Elena also understood the institutional culture that protected senior crew members like Cassandra and Captain Mitchell, while punishing those who challenged their authority regardless of how justified such challenges might be. The turning point came when Ambassador Williams decided that her diplomatic obligations extended beyond international relations to basic human decency. Rising from her seat with the kind of authority that had commanded attention in United Nations meetings, she approached Devon's row with a bottle of water from her personal supply. "Sir," she said clearly, her voice carrying the crisp diction of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Please accept this water. I find the service on this flight to be completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that at least one passenger recognizes what's happening here." The gesture was both generous and strategic, providing Devon with the hydration he had requested, while creating a public record of the discriminatory treatment that would be impossible for the crew to dismiss or rationalize. But Cassandra's response proved that she was determined to dig her professional grave even deeper, approaching Ambassador Williams with the kind of aggressive hostility usually reserved for security threats. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately." Cassandra snapped her professional composure, finally cracking to reveal the anger and prejudice that had been driving her behavior throughout the flight. "Passengers are not allowed to interfere with crew operations or distribute items without permission." Ambassador Williams straightened to her full height, and for a moment the cabin felt like a diplomatic reception, where someone had just committed an unforgivable breach of protocol. "Young lady," she said in a voice that had silenced hostile negotiators in 3 languages, "I am a United States ambassador, and I am witnessing treatment that violates not only your company's stated policies but basic standards of human decency. This passenger made a simple, polite request for water, and you responded with hostility and discrimination that I will be documenting in my official report. The threat of diplomatic attention should have triggered immediate damage control from any competent flight crew, but Cassandra had passed beyond the point where rational decision-making was possible. "I don't care if you're the president," she replied with the kind of career-ending insubordination that would be quoted in business schools as an example of how not to handle customer complaints. "On this aircraft, I'm in charge of passenger services, and I decide who gets what and when they get it." Devon watched this exchange with the fascination of someone observing a perfect storm of professional incompetence and personal prejudice combining to create a situation that would have consequences far beyond anything the participants could imagine. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his legal team. "Full documentation activated. Federal authorities notified. Termination protocols prepared. Your authorization required to proceed." As Cassandra stormed back toward the galley, muttering comments about difficult passengers and people who don't know their place, Devon typed a single word in response to his legal team's message: "Execute." What happened next transformed Devon's discrimination complaint from a civil rights issue into a federal crime investigation, as Captain Ryan Mitchell's personal weaknesses intersected with his professional responsibilities in ways that would ultimately destroy not just his career, but his freedom. The captain's request for alcohol during active flight operations was about to become the most expensive drink in aviation history. Devon had observed Mitchell's casual relationship with alcohol regulations during the pre-flight period, noting the captain's requests to Cassandra and the crew's comfortable compliance with what was clearly a routine arrangement. But witnessing the violation during flight operations elevated the situation from a company policy issue to a federal crime that could result in imprisonment and the permanent grounding of every crew member who had knowledge of the captain's behavior. "Cassandra, I think I need that special coffee we discussed," Mitchell said as he settled into the galley area during his scheduled break, using the coded language that he and his crew had developed to discuss his alcohol consumption without creating obvious evidence of their regulatory violations. "The turbulence reports ahead look concerning, and I want to make sure my nerves are steady for the approach into LAX." The rationalization was as predictable as it was pathetic, transforming a criminal violation of federal aviation safety regulations into a professional necessity that demonstrated the captain's commitment to passenger safety. Mitchell had been using variations of this excuse for months, convincing himself and his crew that a few drinks actually made him a better pilot by reducing his anxiety and improving his focus during challenging flight conditions. Cassandra retrieved the bottle of 18-year-old Macallan Scotch from the secure liquor storage, pouring a generous measure into a coffee cup that would provide visual cover for the captain's violation. She had participated in this routine so many times that she no longer felt any discomfort about enabling behavior that she knew could result in criminal charges for everyone involved having rationalized her complicity as loyalty to a respected captain who deserved certain accommodations due to his experience and seniority. Devon's position in Seat 2C provided him with a clear line of sight to the galley area through the gap in the curtain that separated business class from the crew service area. When he rose to visit the lavatory, walking past the galley with the casual movement of any passenger attending to routine needs, he witnessed Captain Mitchell consuming alcohol with the unmistakable posture and facial expressions of someone who was drinking something significantly stronger than coffee. The federal aviation regulations were crystal clear and absolutely inflexible. No alcohol consumption within 8 hours of flight. Operations zero tolerance for any blood alcohol content during active duty, and immediate license, revocation for any pilot found to be drinking while responsible for passenger safety. Mitchell's violation wasn't just breaking company policy. It was endangering the lives of everyone aboard the aircraft and committing a federal crime that carried potential prison sentences. Devon's response was calculated and precise, designed to create an official record of his concerns while giving the captain every opportunity to explain his behavior in ways that might minimize the eventual consequences. Captain Devon said quietly as he returned from the lavatory, "I hope I'm mistaken, but it appeared that you might be consuming alcohol. Could you clarify what you're drinking?" The question was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that Devon used in business negotiations when he needed to address uncomfortable topics without creating unnecessary hostility. But Mitchell's response revealed exactly how guilty and defensive the captain felt about his behavior. "What did you say to me?" Mitchell snarled, rising from his seat with the kind of aggressive posturing that suggested he was prepared to use physical intimidation rather than reasonable explanation to end the conversation. "Are you accusing a senior captain of Neptune Airways of violating federal regulations?" The deflection was immediate and predictable, transforming Devon's reasonable inquiry into an attack on Mitchell's professional competence and forcing the conversation away from the actual behavior that was being questioned. But Devon had dealt with defensive executives throughout his career, and he knew exactly how to maintain focus on the substantive issues while documenting the subject's responses for later legal proceedings. "I'm simply asking for clarification," Devon replied calmly, his voice carrying the kind of steady authority that had served him well in hostile negotiations. Federal regulations prohibit alcohol consumption during flight operations, and passenger safety requires that flight crews maintain complete sobriety. If you're consuming alcohol, that's a serious safety concern that needs to be addressed immediately. Mitchell's face flushed red with a combination of alcohol, anger, and panic as he realized that his routine violation had been observed by someone who clearly understood the regulatory framework and legal implications of his behavior. Instead of acknowledging the problem and seeking to minimize the damage through honest communication, Mitchell chose to escalate the confrontation in ways that would ultimately make his situation much worse. "You need to sit down and mind your own business," Mitchell growled, stepping closer to Devon in a clear attempt to use his physical size and authority to intimidate a passenger who was asking legitimate questions about flight safety. "I don't know who you think you are, but on this aircraft I'm in command and I don't answer to passengers who don't understand how airlines operate." The threat was both unprofessional and counterproductive, creating additional evidence of Mitchell's poor judgment while failing to address the underlying safety concerns that Devon had raised. But what Mitchell didn't realize was that his intimidation tactics were being recorded not just by Devon's phone, but by multiple aircraft systems that were now under the control of Devon's technical team. Jordan Kim had witnessed the entire interaction from her position in the rear galley, and her growing discomfort with the crew's behavior was reaching the point where her conscience was overriding her concerns about job security. She had seen Captain Mitchell drinking on previous flights, always rationalized as medical necessity or professional stress management. but she had never seen him challenged directly about his behavior or forced to defend his violations in front of witnesses. Helena Rodriguez was also observing the confrontation, torn between her understanding that Mitchell was clearly in the wrong and her awareness that challenging the captain could result in career consequences that would extend far beyond this single flight. The airline industry's culture of hierarchy and loyalty made it extremely difficult for junior crew members to report senior personnel even when they witnessed clear violations of safety regulations. Cassandra Blake chose this moment to demonstrate the depth of her professional incompetence by inserting herself into a situation that was already spiraling beyond her ability to control or understand. "Captain, this passenger has been problematic since boarding," she announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed her authority was absolute and unquestionable. "He's been demanding special treatment, and now he's harassing you about your coffee consumption. I think we need to file a report about his disruptive behavior." The suggestion was so spectacularly misinformed that it would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high, transforming Devon's legitimate safety concerns into disruptive behavior, while characterizing Mitchell's alcohol violation as innocent coffee consumption. But Cassandra's intervention served Devon's purposes perfectly, creating additional documentation of the crew's willingness to file false reports and misrepresent passenger behavior to protect their own violations. "That's an excellent idea," Cassandra Mitchell said, his relief obvious as he seized on the opportunity to transform himself from perpetrator to victim. "File a full report about this passenger's threatening behavior and his attempts to interfere with flight operations. I want law enforcement to meet us at LAX to deal with his harassment of the flight crew." The decision to file false reports with law enforcement elevated the situation from civil rights violations and regulatory infractions to criminal conspiracy charges that could result in federal prison sentences for everyone involved. Devon listened to their planning with the fascination of someone watching opponents in a negotiation make strategic errors that would ultimately destroy their positions and strengthen his leverage exponentially. As Mitchell returned to the cockpit and Cassandra began documenting her fictional account of Devon's behavior, neither of them realized that they were creating evidence for their own prosecution while targeting the one person on the aircraft who had the power to end their careers immediately, and the legal resources to ensure that their false reports would result in criminal charges that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The transformation of Devon Washington from passenger to perceived threat happened with the speed and efficiency of a well-orchestrated character assassination as Captain Mitchell and Cassandra Blake constructed their false narrative with the confidence of people who had never faced consequences for their actions. Their radio communication with ground control would become evidence in federal court preserved in digital formats that would make their lies impossible to deny or rationalize. Los Angeles Control Neptune 847, requesting priority handling for passenger disturbance. Mitchell's voice crackled through the aircraft's communication system with the authoritative tone he had perfected over 20 years of commercial flying. "We have a disruptive passenger in business class making threats against flight crew and interfering with safety operations. Request law enforcement meet aircraft at gate for removal and possible federal charges." The request triggered immediate responses from multiple agencies as threats against flight crews were treated as potential terrorist incidents, requiring coordination between airport police, federal air marshals, TSA security specialists, and FBI counterterrorism units. Mitchell's false report was about to mobilize hundreds of law enforcement officers and create a federal investigation that would ultimately focus on his own criminal behavior rather than Devon's imaginary threats. Cassandra was simultaneously crafting her written report with the kind of creative fiction that would have impressed novelists if it weren't being submitted as an official document in a federal investigation. "Passenger in seat 2C has exhibited aggressive behavior since boarding, making unreasonable demands for special treatment and becoming hostile when normal service procedures were explained." Passenger then approached Captain Mitchell in threatening manner, making accusations about crew behavior, and refusing to comply with instructions to return to seat. Passenger appears to be intoxicated or under influence of controlled substances exhibiting paranoid behavior and making wild claims about safety violations that have no basis in reality. The fabrication was so complete and so detailed that it would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't witnessed the actual interactions transforming Devon's polite water request into unreasonable demands, his legitimate safety concerns into paranoid accusations, and his calm demeanor into threatening behavior. But every word of Cassandra's report was contradicted by video evidence, audio recordings, and witness testimony that would ultimately send both her and Captain Mitchell to federal prison. What neither of them anticipated was that their false narrative would intersect with the modern reality of social media documentation, as passengers throughout the aircraft had been recording the discriminatory treatment and crew misconduct with the kind of real-time journalism that made traditional media gatekeeping irrelevant. The truth was being broadcast to the world, even as Mitchell and Cassandra were constructing their lies. Ambassador Patricia Williams had been documenting the crew's behavior through official diplomatic channels, creating a record that would reach State Department officials and international aviation authorities within hours of the flight's conclusion. Her status as a senior diplomat gave her testimony a weight and credibility that would be impossible for Neptune Airways to dismiss or minimize, particularly when combined with her professional expertise in recognizing and reporting discrimination. But the most damaging documentation was coming from an unexpected source, Dr. Sarah Chen, a technology executive in Seat 3A who had been live streaming her flight experience to her 2 million social media followers as part of a business travel vlog. Her audience had been watching the crew's discriminatory behavior in real time, and her comment sections were exploding with outrage and demands for accountability that were already forcing Neptune Airways' social media team into crisis management mode. Folks, I need to pause my usual travel content because I'm witnessing something on this flight that I've never seen before. Dr. Chen whispered to her phone camera, her voice filled with the kind of shocked disbelief that made for compelling social media content. The flight crew is openly discriminating against a passenger who has been nothing but polite and respectful, and now they're claiming he's been threatening them when I've been watching the entire interaction and he's done nothing wrong. The live stream was being shared and reshared across multiple platforms with hashtags like #Neptune Airways Scandal and #Flight Discrimination, trending globally as viewers expressed their outrage and shared their own experiences with airline discrimination. The story was developing a viral momentum that would make it impossible for Neptune Airways to contain or control through traditional corporate damage control strategies. Dr. Chen's technical expertise also allowed her to capture high-quality video evidence that would be admissible in federal court, using professional-grade recording equipment to document not just the discriminatory behavior, but also Captain Mitchell's alcohol consumption and the crew's coordination of their false reports. Her footage would become crucial evidence in the criminal prosecution that was already being prepared by federal prosecutors who were monitoring the situation through channels that neither Mitchell nor Cassandra understood. The passengers in business class were also creating their own documentary record, with the businessman in Seat 2D recording audio on his phone and the family in Seats 1B and 1C taking photographs that captured the crew's hostile behavior and Devon's calm responses. The convergence of multiple documentation sources was creating an evidentiary record that would make the truth impossible to deny, regardless of how sophisticated the false narrative being constructed by the crew might appear. But perhaps the most compelling documentation was being created by Devon himself, whose legal team was recording not just the passenger cabin interactions, but also the crew's private communications, the aircraft's internal systems, and the ground control radio traffic that was being used to support false criminal charges. The comprehensive nature of Devon's evidence collection would ultimately reveal the full scope of the crew's misconduct and criminal behavior. As Flight 847 continued its journey toward Los Angeles, the gap between reality and the false narrative being constructed by Captain Mitchell and Cassandra Blake was widening into a chasm that would swallow their careers and their freedom. They had chosen to respond to their own criminal behavior by filing false reports against an innocent passenger, escalating their regulatory violations into federal crimes, while creating a paper trail that would ensure their prosecution and imprisonment. The aircraft was carrying more than passengers across the Atlantic. It was carrying evidence of discrimination, criminal misconduct, and false reporting that would ultimately transform Neptune Airways' corporate culture and send shockwaves through the entire airline industry. Devon Washington had boarded the flight as a passenger seeking respectful treatment, but he was approaching Los Angeles as the owner of an airline with the evidence and authority to ensure that no future passenger would experience the discrimination that had been directed at him. The viral nature of the story was already forcing Neptune Airways executives into emergency meetings as their stock price began fluctuating and their social media channels were overwhelmed with complaints and demands for accountability. The company's crisis management team was preparing responses to a story they didn't yet fully understand, not knowing that their new owner was the target of their employees' discrimination and false reporting. Within hours of landing, the convergence of social media documentation, diplomatic reporting, federal investigation, and Devon's comprehensive evidence collection would create a perfect storm of accountability that would reshape not just individual careers, but institutional practices throughout the aviation industry. The crew's decision to escalate their misconduct through false reporting had ensured that their downfall would be as public and complete as their initial discrimination had been blatant and inexcusable. The descent into Los Angeles International Airport felt different than any landing in Devon Washington's extensive travel experience, not because of the aircraft's performance or the weather conditions, but because he knew that the next hour would transform the lives of everyone aboard Flight 847 in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. As the runway lights grew larger through his window and the familiar sprawl of Los Angeles stretched to the horizon, Devon felt the cold satisfaction of a master strategist whose long-term planning was about to deliver justice with surgical precision. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through the passenger address system with the forced confidence of someone trying to maintain authority while knowing that his world was about to collapse around him. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final approach into Los Angeles International Airport. Ground control has informed us that we'll be met by airport security upon arrival to address a passenger disturbance that occurred during the flight. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the situation has been resolved. The announcement sent ripples of curiosity and concern through the cabin as passengers who had witnessed the actual interactions between Devon and the crew tried to reconcile their observations with the captain's characterization of events. Ambassador Williams shook her head in disgust while Dr. Chen continued her live stream commentary for her increasingly outraged audience of millions. Folks, the captain just announced that airport security is going to meet the aircraft because of the passenger disturbance, Doctor, Chen whispered to her camera. But I've been documenting this entire flight, and the only disturbance has been the crew's discriminatory behavior, and now their obvious attempt to blame the passenger they've been mistreating. Devon's phone buzzed with an encrypted message that brought a slight smile to his face. Phoenix Protocol fully activated. All assets in position. Legal team standing by. Federal authorities briefed and coordinated. Your employees are about to receive the education of their lifetimes. The landing was rougher than necessary as Captain Mitchell's alcohol-impaired motor skills and emotional agitation combined to produce the kind of sloppy approach that experienced passengers immediately recognized as substandard. The aircraft hit the runway hard enough to rattle overhead bins and elicit nervous laughter from passengers who weren't sure whether to be concerned about the captain's competence or relieved to be safely on the ground. As Flight 847 taxied toward Gate 41, Devon could see through his window that the reception committee waiting for them was far larger and more official than anything Captain Mitchell's false reports should have generated. Airport police vehicles were positioned around the gate, their emergency lights creating a light show that suggested a major security incident rather than a routine passenger disturbance. But what Captain Mitchell and Cassandra Blake couldn't see from their positions on the aircraft was the second group of officials waiting in the jet bridge. Neptune Airways' entire executive leadership team, led by Chief Executive Officer Amanda Foster, and flanked by the heads of Human Resources, Legal Affairs, and Corporate Security. They had been summoned by encrypted communications from their new owner, and they were carrying termination paperwork, federal investigation files, and breathalyzer equipment that would shortly document Captain Mitchell's criminal behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while airport security boards the aircraft," Cassandra announced through the passenger address system, her voice filled with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had successfully neutralized a problematic passenger and demonstrated her professional competence to her supervisors. "This will only take a few minutes, and then you'll be free to deplane normally." Devon unbuckled his seatbelt as the aircraft came to a complete stop, retrieving his messenger bag from the overhead bin with the calm deliberation of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and had prepared for every contingency. He could hear Cassandra and Captain Mitchell congratulating each other in the galley area, their voices filled with the relief and satisfaction that comes from believing you've successfully navigated a challenging situation. "I think we handled that perfectly." Mitchell said, his words slightly slurred from the alcohol he had consumed during the flight. "The passenger will be arrested for threatening the crew, and our reports will show that we maintained safety and professionalism throughout the incident. This should be a textbook case for how to deal with disruptive passengers." The jet bridge door opened with its familiar mechanical sound, but instead of airport security officers, the first person to board the aircraft was CEO Amanda Foster, whose expression combined professional embarrassment with personal outrage as she made direct eye contact with Devon Washington and nodded with the kind of respectful acknowledgement usually reserved for visiting heads of state. "Mr. Washington," Foster said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the business-class cabin and immediately silencing the crew's self-congratulatory conversation on behalf of Neptune Airways. "I want to apologize for the treatment you received during this flight. We are here to address this situation immediately and comprehensively." The use of Devon's name hit Captain Mitchell and Cassandra Blake like a physical blow as they suddenly realized that the passenger they had been discriminating against and filing false reports about was not only known to their CEO, but was being treated with a level of deference that suggested significant importance and authority. "I'm sorry, who?" Cassandra stammered, her confidence evaporating as she struggled to understand how a passenger in a hoodie had somehow become the focus of her CEO's personal attention and apparent concern. Devon rose from his seat with the fluid grace of someone who had just concluded a successful business negotiation, removing his casual hoodie to reveal the tailored Italian dress shirt underneath, transforming his appearance from casual passenger to unmistakable executive with the simple gesture of changing clothes. "Good evening, Ms. Foster," Devon said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded billion-dollar boardrooms for nearly 2 decades. "I appreciate you and your team responding so quickly to my communications. I believe we have several serious matters to discuss regarding flight crew performance and federal aviation violations." The words fell into the cabin like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion that spread from the crew to the passengers, to the airport security officers, who were beginning to realize that they had been called to investigate a situation that was far more complex than the false reports had indicated. Captain Mitchell's face went through a series of color changes that would have been comical if the circumstances weren't so serious, shifting from confusion to recognition to absolute terror as he began to understand that his casual discrimination and criminal behavior had been directed at someone with the power to destroy his career and his freedom. "Sir, I don't understand," Mitchell said, his voice cracking with panic as he struggled to maintain some semblance of professional composure while his world crumbled around him. "Who are you? What's happening here?" Devon's response was delivered with the kind of quiet precision that had made him legendary in business negotiations, each word chosen for maximum impact and clarity. "Captain Mitchell, My name is Devon Washington, and as of 72 hours ago, I am the owner of Neptune Airways. That means I own this aircraft, this gate, your employment contract, and until approximately 60 seconds ago, I owned your future with this company." The revelation hit the assembled group like a physical explosion, sending shockwaves through everyone present as they realized the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Cassandra Blake actually staggered backward, grabbing the nearest seat back for support as the full implications of Devon's identity crashed over her like a tsunami. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of aircraft engines and ground equipment outside. "You were wearing a hoodie. You're just a passenger. This has to be some kind of mistake." Devon's smile was thin and cold as winter rain as he reached into his messenger bag and withdrew a leather portfolio that he handed to CEO Foster. "The acquisition documents are all there, Amanda. Meridian Holdings completed the purchase through our London subsidiary on Tuesday. I wanted to experience Neptune Airways' service culture firsthand before implementing the changes that are clearly necessary." Foster opened the portfolio with hands that trembled slightly, scanning the legal documents that confirmed Devon's ownership and authority. Her face went pale as she realized that her new owner had been subjected to discrimination and false criminal charges by her own employees, creating a liability exposure that could destroy the company's reputation and result in federal prosecution for multiple crew members. Mr. Washington Foster said, her voice filled with professional horror and personal embarrassment. "I am profoundly sorry for what you experienced on this flight. We will address this situation immediately and comprehensively." Devon nodded toward Captain Mitchell, whose alcohol consumption was becoming increasingly obvious as the stress of the situation overwhelmed his ability to maintain professional composure. "Amanda, I witnessed Captain Mitchell consuming alcohol during flight operations, which is a federal crime. I believe your security team has breathalyzer equipment that can confirm his blood alcohol content." The suggestion sent Mitchell into complete panic as he realized that his alcohol violation was about to be documented and reported to federal authorities, ending not just his career but potentially resulting in criminal charges and imprisonment. "You can't do that," Mitchell shouted, his professional demeanor completely abandoned as desperation took control. "I know my rights. I demand union representation." Devon's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone who had studied federal aviation law as part of his acquisition research. "Captain, under federal aviation regulation, 91.17 refusal to submit to alcohol testing is grounds for immediate license revocation. You can certainly request union representation, but the breathalyzer test will happen now with or without your cooperation." The breathalyzer test, administered to Captain Ryan Mitchell in full view of passengers, crew, and airport officials, became the most humiliating moment in his 20-year aviation career, as the digital display showed a blood alcohol content of 0.08, twice the legal limit for commercial pilots and high enough to trigger immediate federal prosecution for endangering passenger safety. Mitchell stared at the device with the expression of someone watching his entire life collapse in real time. Knowing that the reading would be reported to the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department of Transportation, and federal prosecutors, who treated alcohol violations by commercial pilots as serious crimes, requiring imprisonment to deter future offenders. Captain Mitchell Devon said with the calm precision of someone delivering a verdict that had been carefully considered and was absolutely final, "Your employment with Neptune Airways is terminated immediately for violation of federal safety regulations, endangering passenger lives, and filing false reports with law enforcement agencies. You will never fly for this airline or any other commercial carrier again." The words were delivered without anger or satisfaction, simply as a statement of fact that reflected the natural consequences of Mitchell's choices and behavior. Devon had learned long ago that justice was most effective when it was administered calmly and professionally, without the emotional drama that could distract from the essential message that actions have consequences. Cassandra Blake watched Mitchell's destruction with growing terror. realizing that her own false reports and discriminatory behavior were about to receive the same level of scrutiny and accountability. Her hands shook as she tried to maintain some semblance of professional composure while understanding that her career was ending in the most public and humiliating way possible. Ms. Blake, CEO Amanda Foster, said, retrieving a thick manila envelope from her briefcase, "You are also terminated immediately for discriminatory treatment of passengers filing false reports with law enforcement and conduct unbecoming a Neptune Airways employee. Security will escort you from the premises immediately." The termination letter contained not just the end of Cassandra's employment, but also notification that she would be facing federal charges for filing false police reports, a felony that could result in imprisonment and permanent exclusion from employment in the transportation industry. But Devon wasn't finished demonstrating the comprehensive nature of his evidence collection and the thoroughness of his response to the discrimination he had experienced. "Amanda, I want you and your legal team to review the complete audio and video documentation of this flight," he said, handing over an encrypted digital storage device. Everything that happened was recorded through multiple sources, including the aircraft's internal security systems that are now under our administrative control. The device contained hours of high-definition video footage from every angle in the passenger cabin, crystal-clear audio recordings of crew conversations and passenger interactions, and complete documentation of Captain Mitchell's alcohol consumption and the crew's coordination of false reports. The evidence was so comprehensive and so clearly admissible in federal court that it would make denial or rationalization impossible. Foster accepted the device with the grim understanding that she was holding evidence that would reshape her company's policies and procedures while sending former employees to federal prison. The liability exposure was staggering, but the opportunity for transformation was equally significant if they could demonstrate genuine commitment to change. Mr. Washington Foster said, "How do you want us to proceed with the other crew members who witnessed these violations but failed to report them?" Devon considered the question carefully, understanding that justice required proportional responses rather than blanket punishment that could destroy innocent people who had been trapped in an institutional culture that discouraged speaking up about misconduct. Elena Rodriguez will be suspended pending investigation. Devon decided. Her failure to intervene was problematic, but she wasn't actively participating in the discrimination or false reporting. Jordan Kim will be retained and promoted to senior flight attendant immediately. She showed moral courage by providing honest testimony when it mattered, even though she was afraid of losing her job. The differentiated responses demonstrated Devon's understanding that transforming corporate culture required rewarding ethical behavior as much as punishing misconduct. Creating incentives for employees to choose integrity over institutional loyalty when conflicts arose. Jordan Kim stepped forward, with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the recognition that her honesty had been rewarded rather than punished. "Mr. Washington, thank you for seeing that some of us wanted to do the right thing, but didn't know how to challenge the people in authority." Devon's response reflected his understanding that meaningful change required creating safe spaces for ethical behavior rather than simply punishing wrongdoing after it occurred. "Jordan, part of my responsibility as owner is to ensure that employees like you never have to choose between doing the right thing and keeping your job. Those conflicts shouldn't exist in a properly managed organization." Ambassador Patricia Williams had been observing the entire confrontation with the professional interest of someone who had witnessed similar accountability processes in diplomatic settings. She approached Devon as the terminated crew members were being escorted away by airport security. Mr. Washington Williams said, "I've served as a United States ambassador for 15 years, and I've rarely seen such a clear example of how individual accountability can drive institutional change. Your response has been both proportional and transformative." Devon appreciated the diplomatic perspective, understanding that Williams's testimony would carry significant weight in any legal proceedings that might arise from the incident. Ambassador discrimination thrives in environments where people believe they can act with impunity. Today's events demonstrate that accountability is possible when evidence is comprehensive and response is immediate. Dr. Sarah Chen was still live streaming to her millions of followers, providing real-time commentary on what she was describing as the most dramatic reversal of fortune she had ever witnessed. Her audience was exploding with comments expressing satisfaction that justice had been served and amazement at the thoroughness of Devon's documentation and response. "Folks, I've been covering business and technology for 10 years. But I've never seen anything like what just happened on this aircraft," Dr. Chen said to her camera. "The passenger who was being discriminated against turned out to be the owner of the airline, and he just fired the people who were mistreating him. This is going to be studied in business schools for decades." The viral nature of the story was already creating pressure on other airlines to examine their own policies and procedures as social media users shared their own experiences with discriminatory treatment and demanded similar accountability from other carriers. The Neptune Airways incident was becoming a catalyst for industry-wide change rather than an isolated example of individual misconduct. The press conference that Devon Washington held in Neptune Airways corporate headquarters 2 days after Flight 847 became a masterclass in crisis communication and transformational leadership as he demonstrated how individual accountability could drive institutional change when combined with comprehensive evidence and strategic communication. The conference room was packed with journalists from major news outlets, aviation industry analysts, civil rights advocates, and business leaders who wanted to understand how a single flight had triggered such comprehensive organizational change. Devon stood at the podium with the calm confidence of someone who had transformed the crisis into an opportunity for meaningful reform. "Ladies and gentlemen," Devon began, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded billion-dollar boardrooms while maintaining the accessibility that made complex issues understandable to general audiences. 2 days ago, I experienced discrimination on one of my own aircraft because employees made assumptions based on my appearance rather than treating me with the dignity that every passenger deserves. The opening statement immediately established the personal nature of the experience while connecting it to universal principles of respect and dignity that resonated with audiences regardless of their background or experience with discrimination. The crew's response to their misconduct was to file false reports, with law enforcement escalating their discrimination into criminal behavior that endangered public safety and violated federal law. This was not a training issue or a communication problem. This was a failure of character and institutional culture that demanded immediate and comprehensive response. Devon's framing of the issue avoided the kind of abstract discussions about bias and prejudice that often made discrimination cases seem theoretical, instead focusing on concrete actions and clear violations that created undeniable accountability. Effective immediately. Neptune Airways is implementing the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in the aviation industry, Devon announced, gesturing toward a presentation screen that displayed the key elements of the transformation initiative. Every employee from ground crews to senior executives will complete intensive training on respectful service and bias recognition. Anonymous reporting systems will allow employees to document discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. And most importantly, discrimination will result in immediate termination, regardless of seniority or position. The program Devon outlined went far beyond standard diversity training or policy updates, creating structural changes that would make discriminatory behavior virtually impossible to hide or rationalize. The combination of training, reporting systems, and clear consequences represented a comprehensive approach to cultural transformation that other companies would quickly adopt. But policy changes alone are insufficient. Devon continued. Cultural transformation requires leadership that demonstrates, rather than simply declares, organizational values. Jordan Kim, who showed moral courage by providing honest testimony about crew misconduct, has been promoted to Director of Customer Experience. She will oversee the implementation of our new service standards and ensure that every passenger receives respectful treatment. The promotion of Jordan Kim sent a clear message that ethical behavior would be rewarded rather than merely protected, creating incentives for employees to speak up about misconduct rather than remaining silent to protect their careers. Ambassador Patricia Williams has agreed to serve on our newly created Passenger Dignity Advisory Board, providing independent oversight of our service standards and discrimination prevention efforts. Her diplomatic experience and commitment to human rights make her uniquely qualified to guide our transformation process. The inclusion of Ambassador Williams demonstrated Devon's understanding that meaningful accountability required external oversight rather than relying solely on internal processes that could be compromised by institutional loyalties or conflicts of interest. The viral nature of this story has created an opportunity for industry-wide change that extends far beyond Neptune Airways, Devon observed. Other airlines are already updating their policies and procedures, recognizing that discriminatory treatment is not just morally wrong, but also financially destructive in an era of social media accountability. Devon's analysis reflected his understanding that individual cases of injustice could drive broader change when they were properly documented and strategically communicated to audiences that had the power to demand accountability from other organizations. Federal prosecutors are reviewing the evidence of false reporting and safety violations that occurred on Flight 847, and additional criminal charges may be filed against crew members who endangered passenger safety through their misconduct. This investigation demonstrates that discrimination and false reporting will face legal consequences rather than just employment termination. The threat of criminal prosecution elevated the stakes beyond simple job loss making. Clear that serious misconduct would result in consequences that extended far beyond the workplace into personal freedom and professional reputation. Most importantly, Devon concluded this incident demonstrates that change is possible when victims of discrimination have the resources and determination to demand accountability. Too many people experience discriminatory treatment and accept it as inevitable because they believe they lack the power to challenge institutional prejudice. Today's events prove that power structures can be transformed when evidence is comprehensive and response is strategic. The message resonated with audiences who had experienced discrimination in various forms, providing both validation for their experiences and hope that accountability was possible even against powerful institutions. The question and answer session that followed the presentation allowed Devon to address concerns about the scope and sustainability of the changes he was implementing, demonstrating his commitment to long-term transformation rather than temporary damage control. Mr. Washington asked a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, "Critics argue that your response was disproportionate to the actual discrimination you experienced. How do you respond to suggestions that you used your position as owner to exact personal revenge?" Devon's response reflected his understanding that criticism was inevitable, but that the evidence would ultimately support his actions. The breathalyzer test that showed Captain Mitchell's blood alcohol content at twice the legal limit for commercial pilots wasn't personal revenge. It was documentation of criminal behavior that endangered every passenger on that aircraft. The false police reports filed by crew members weren't addressed through personal retaliation, but through legal processes that hold people accountable for filing fraudulent criminal charges. The factual response neutralized attempts to characterize accountability as vindictiveness, while maintaining focus on the substantive violations that had occurred. The transformation we're implementing at Neptune Airways isn't about punishing past misconduct. It's about preventing future discrimination through comprehensive policy changes, training programs, and oversight mechanisms that make respectful treatment the standard rather than the exception. Devon's emphasis on prevention rather than punishment demonstrated his understanding that sustainable change required positive incentives rather than relying solely on fear of consequences to modify behavior. 6 months after Flight 847 became the most documented case of airline discrimination in history. Devon Washington found himself in the same seat on the same route, but everything else about the experience had been transformed in ways that proved how quickly institutional culture could change when leadership was committed to genuine reform rather than superficial damage control. The crew that greeted him as he boarded the aircraft represented the new Neptune Airways that had emerged from the crisis, led by Captain Maria Santos, a Latina pilot who had been promoted from regional operations as part of Devon's commitment to diversifying leadership positions throughout the company. Her welcome was both professional and genuinely warm, reflecting the kind of respectful service that had become standard across the airline's entire fleet. "Mr. Washington, welcome aboard," Captain Santos said with the confidence of someone who understood that her authority came from competence rather than intimidation. "We're honored to have you flying with us today, and I want you to know that this crew is committed to providing exceptional service to every passenger aboard this aircraft." The difference in tone and approach was immediately apparent to Devon, representing not just individual attitude changes, but a fundamental shift in how Neptune Airways employees understood their roles and responsibilities to passengers. Jordan Kim had indeed been transformed by her promotion to Director of Customer Experience, developing from a nervous junior flight attendant into a confident leader whose training programs were being adopted by airlines throughout the industry. She approached Devon's seat with a tablet containing customer feedback data that demonstrated the measurable impact of the changes they had implemented. "Mr. Washington," Jordan said, her voice filled with professional pride and personal satisfaction, "I wanted to share some numbers with you. Customer satisfaction scores have increased by 47% since we implemented the new service standards. More importantly, we haven't received a single discrimination complaint in the past 4 months, compared to an average of 12 per month under the previous policies." The data represented more than statistical improvement. It reflected real changes in how hundreds of thousands of passengers were being treated during their travel experiences, multiplying the impact of Flight 847's transformation across countless individual interactions. But the most meaningful validation of the changes came from an unexpected source: a young black teenager traveling alone in Seat 1A, confidently reviewing what appeared to be college admission materials, while being served with the same attention and respect that every passenger received as a matter of course, rather than special consideration. Devon observed the crew's interactions with the young man, noting the genuine friendliness and professional courtesy that characterized every exchange. There were no assumptions about whether he belonged in first class, no subtle signals that his presence was somehow problematic or unexpected, no differential treatment that would have indicated ongoing bias or discrimination. "Excuse me," the teenager said to Jordan as she passed his seat. "Could I get some extra water? I need to take some medication." "Of course," Jordan replied immediately, retrieving several bottles from the service cart. "Would you also like some juice or a snack?" Sometimes medication works better with food. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but it represented everything that Devon had hoped to achieve through his transformation of Neptune Airways. Simple human needs were met with immediate attention and genuine care without any of the judgment or resistance that had characterized Cassandra Blake's discriminatory behavior. Devon's reflection on the changes was interrupted by a familiar voice from across the aisle, Ambassador Patricia Williams, who had become a regular passenger on Neptune Airways and an active member of the Passenger Dignity Advisory Board that provided ongoing oversight of the airline's service standards. Devon Ambassador Williams said with the warmth of someone who had witnessed transformation and understood its significance, "I've been flying internationally for 25 years, and I can honestly say that Neptune Airways now provides the most consistently respectful service of any carrier I've experienced. You've created something remarkable here." The validation from someone with Ambassador Williams' experience and credibility meant more to Devon than any business metric or financial indicator could provide, confirming that the changes had achieved their intended purpose of eliminating discriminatory treatment for all passengers. The conversation was overheard by Dr. Sarah Chen, who was once again documenting her travel experience for her social media followers. But this time, her content focused on positive examples of excellent service rather than discrimination and misconduct. "Folks, I'm flying Neptune Airways again, and I have to say that the transformation has been incredible," Dr. Chen said to her camera. "6 months ago, I documented some of the worst discriminatory behavior I've ever witnessed on an aircraft. Today, I'm seeing service standards that should be the model for the entire industry." The contrast between her two documentaries had become part of the broader narrative about how quickly organizational culture could change when accountability was comprehensive and leadership was committed to genuine reform rather than superficial public relations responses. Devon's personal satisfaction with the transformation was deepened by a message he received from his father, Devon Washington, who had followed the entire story through news coverage and social media documentation. The text message was brief, but carried emotional weight, that no business achievement could match. "Son, you did what I never could. You changed the system instead of just surviving it. Mom and I are proud." The acknowledgement from his father represented the completion of a circle that had begun with childhood stories about workplace discrimination and had evolved into the systematic elimination of similar treatment for future generations of travelers. As Flight 847 began its descent into Los Angeles, Devon reflected on the journey from discrimination to transformation that had begun in this same seat 6 months earlier. The young man in 1A was still studying his college materials, completely unaware that his comfortable, respectful travel experience had been made possible by another passenger's refusal to accept discriminatory treatment. That invisible impact represented the true measure of success for Devon's transformation initiative, creating an environment where respectful treatment was so standard that passengers didn't have to think about whether they would be judged by their appearance or treated differently because of assumptions about their background or social status. The aircraft touched down smoothly at LAX, a professional landing that reflected Captain Santos's competence and sobriety, highlighting the contrast with Captain Mitchell's alcohol-impaired performance during the original incident. As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Devon felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning personal injustice into institutional change that would benefit countless people who would never know his name. 1 year after Flight 847 changed the airline industry's understanding of accountability and transformation. Devon Washington stood before a gathering of transportation executives, civil rights leaders, and government officials at the National Transportation Equity Conference, delivering a keynote address that would define the lasting legacy of his experience and the broader movement it had inspired. "A year ago, I asked for a glass of water on one of my own aircraft, and was told that the crew would get to me when they felt like it." Devon began his words, immediately capturing the attention of an audience that had followed his story and understood its significance. That moment of casual discrimination revealed an institutional culture that had normalized disrespectful treatment based on assumptions about passenger worthiness rather than basic human dignity. The conference hall was filled with industry leaders who had implemented similar transformation programs in their own organizations, recognizing that Devon's response to discrimination had created a new standard for accountability that customers now expected from all service providers. The changes at Neptune Airways proved that respectful treatment isn't just morally correct, it's also financially beneficial. Devon continued sharing data that showed how elimination of discriminatory practices had improved customer satisfaction, employee retention, and financial performance across all operational metrics. When people feel respected and valued, they become loyal customers and passionate advocates who drive sustainable business growth. But individual success stories aren't sufficient to address the broader patterns of discrimination that persist throughout the transportation industry, Devon acknowledged. That's why Neptune Airways has partnered with federal agencies, civil rights organizations, and industry associations to develop standardized training programs, accountability measures, and oversight mechanisms that can be implemented across all carriers. The partnership approach reflected Devon's understanding that sustainable change required industry-wide transformation rather than isolated examples of individual company reform. Devon concluded his address with a personal reflection that connected his experience to the broader struggle for dignity and respect that defined civil rights progress. My father spent 37 years working in an industry that never fully recognized his contributions or potential because people made assumptions about his capabilities based on his appearance. Today, young people of all backgrounds can pursue careers in aviation, knowing that their character and competence matter more than others' prejudices. The emotional resonance of Devon's message was evident in the sustained applause that followed his remarks. But the real measure of impact was visible in the concrete changes that had spread throughout the transportation industry in response to the Neptune Airways transformation. As Devon left the conference and returned to his office overlooking Los Angeles International Airport, he could see Neptune Airways aircraft at gates throughout the terminal, each one staffed by crews who had been trained in the respectful service standards that had emerged from Flight 847's painful lessons. The sight represented the multiplication of positive impact that occurred when individual accountability drove institutional change. The young black teenager from his anniversary flight had sent Devon a handwritten thank you note that sat framed on his desk. Mr. Washington, I don't know if you remember me from the flight last month, but I wanted you to know that the respectful treatment I received gave me confidence that I belonged in spaces where people like me weren't always welcome. I start at MIT next month, studying aerospace engineering, and I hope to work for an airline someday, where everyone gets treated with dignity. The note represented everything Devon had hoped to achieve through his transformation of Neptune Airways, creating an environment where young people could pursue their dreams without having to develop armor against discrimination or accept disrespectful treatment as the price of participation in their chosen fields. The simple request for water had become a catalyst for industry-wide change, proving that individual courage combined with strategic documentation and comprehensive response could transform institutional culture in ways that protected countless future victims of discrimination. Devon Washington had turned his personal experience of injustice into a legacy of dignity that would influence how millions of passengers were treated for generations to come. If this story moved you, please subscribe our channel and hit that like button to support more content about dignity defeating discrimination. Share your thoughts in the comments about how individual courage can drive institutional change and let us know where you're watching from. Together, we can continue building a world where respect isn't earned by appearance, but given as a basic human right. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is not proving your worth, but elevating everyone's understanding of what human dignity truly means.